Everyone said Jesus was alive. Thomas heard them, and Thomas still doubted. That is usually the entire summary. Thomas doubted. Case closed. Give him the nickname and move on. But that version is far too simple. Thomas was not doubting an ordinary story. He was being told that death had lost, that Jesus was alive, that everything which had appeared finished had suddenly changed. And there was one important detail. Thomas had not been in the room. When Jesus first appeared to the disciples, the doors were locked. The group was hiding, because openly supporting a recently executed man was not exactly the safest career move in Jerusalem. Then Jesus appeared among them. No warning. No knock. No one opened the door. One moment the disciples were afraid. The next, the man they had watched die was standing in front of them. That probably improved the meeting. Jesus showed them his hands and his side. They saw him. They heard him. They stood in the same room with the impossible. Thomas experienced none of it. For some reason, he was absent. The gospel never explains where he had gone. Maybe he needed food. Maybe he needed air. Maybe he had simply chosen the worst possible moment in history to leave the room. Whatever the reason, Thomas returned after reality had already changed. The disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." To them, this was not a rumor. They had seen Jesus alive. Thomas had only heard their report. And there is a large difference between standing in front of the impossible and receiving the impossible as a summary. The others had watched death lose. Thomas got the meeting notes. It was like arriving late and hearing everyone say, "You missed it. The dead man came back, spoke to us, and changed everything." A normal person might require a moment. Thomas was not being asked to believe that Jesus had escaped danger. He was being asked to believe that Jesus had been crucified, buried, and then walked through a locked room. That was not a small update. Everything Thomas understood about death said this could not happen. Everything his friends were saying claimed that it already had. So Thomas did not celebrate. He did not immediately join their excitement. He did not smile and say, "Yes, that sounds completely reasonable." He resisted. This was the moment that would define him for centuries. The others had also been afraid. They had hidden behind locked doors. They had needed Jesus to appear before their fear turned into joy. But Thomas became famous for doubting because Thomas said the uncomfortable part out loud. The others had sight. Thomas had testimony. And it is much easier to believe the impossible when the impossible is standing in front of you. Thomas was trying to understand something too large after watching everything collapse. Because his doubt did not begin when the disciples said Jesus was alive. It had already begun at the cross. Thomas's doubt did not begin in that room. It began at the cross. Before the famous sentence, before the demand for proof, before centuries of being introduced as the doubting one, Thomas had already watched the story collapse. Jesus had been arrested. The disciples had scattered. Peter had denied knowing him. And Jesus had been crucified in public. So when the others later said, "We have seen the Lord," Thomas was not starting from curiosity. He was starting from the worst ending he could imagine. This is where the simple version begins to crack. Thomas is often treated as if everyone else had accepted everything calmly, while he alone decided to create a problem. That is not what happened. The other disciples were frightened too. They had hidden behind locked doors. They had not spent the weekend confidently explaining resurrection theology to each other. They were trying not to be arrested. Then Jesus appeared. Only after seeing him did their fear turn into joy. Apparently, collapsing after the crucifixion was completely understandable for everyone until Thomas did it out loud. That was when it became his personality. Thomas had never been the cheerful optimist of the group. Earlier, when Jesus decided to return to Judea despite the danger, Thomas had said they should go with him, even if they died too. Very encouraging. But it also showed something important. Thomas was willing to follow Jesus while expecting the worst. Then the worst happened. The cross did not simply disappoint him. It seemed to prove that the mission was over. The teacher was dead. The movement was exposed. The disciples were hiding. Every promise now had to compete with a very visible Roman execution. And Rome had not left much room for a sequel. From Thomas's point of view, the story had reached its final scene. Now the others were telling him that the final scene had been reversed while he was away. It was like watching a building collapse and then hearing someone say, "Good news, it is standing again." Most people would have questions. Thomas had more than questions. He had memory. He remembered what Rome did to people. He remembered what crucifixion meant. The cross was not designed to create uncertainty. It was designed to end things, and now his friends were claiming that it had failed. Thomas was not rejecting an ordinary claim. He was being asked to believe that the worst thing he had witnessed had just been undone. The others had seen Jesus. Thomas had seen the ending. That was the real division in the room. They were speaking from encounter. He was reacting from the cross. So Thomas listened. He saw their excitement. He heard their certainty. For them, those words announced a beginning. For Thomas, they demanded that he completely ignore the ending he had already accepted as final. And then came the sentence he could not simply accept. "We have seen the Lord. We have seen the Lord." Thomas heard the sentence and froze. For the other disciples, those words were not an argument. They were a memory. They had seen Jesus standing in the room. They had heard his voice. They had looked at the wounds. They had watched fear turn into shock and shock turn into joy. Thomas had missed all of it. They had experience. He had testimony. And testimony can be powerful, but it is not the same as watching a crucified man appear behind a locked door. The difference was now impossible to ignore. The others believed because they had seen. Thomas was being asked to believe because they said they had seen. That was where he stopped. He did not ask for a better explanation. He did not request a longer speech. He did not need one of them to draw a helpful resurrection chart on the wall. He asked for the marks. Thomas said that unless he saw the nail marks in Jesus' hands, placed his finger where the nails had been, and put his hand into Jesus' side, he would not believe. That was not a vague request. Thomas did not want inspiration. He wanted evidence. More specifically, he wanted the evidence left by the cross. The wounds that seemed to prove Jesus was dead would now have to prove that he was alive. That is what made his demand so revealing. Thomas was not asking Jesus to perform a new miracle. He was asking for the old disaster to be shown in a completely different light. The others were saying, "He is alive." Thomas was saying, "Then show me what happened to the wounds." Very warm, very subtle, completely normal dinner conversation. But underneath the bluntness was a real divide. The disciples were speaking from encounter. Thomas was still standing in the shadow of the crucifixion. Their certainty could not simply become his certainty because they repeated it with confidence. They could describe the room. They could describe Jesus. They could tell Thomas exactly what happened, but they could not transfer the moment into his eyes. It was like receiving an impossible message and thinking, "I want this to be true, but I need to see it outside the screen." The others had eyewitness testimony. Thomas had the summary of a meeting he had missed through one astonishingly bad absence. So Thomas remained unconvinced, not half convinced, not politely uncertain, unconvinced. And yet, he stayed. That detail matters. Thomas doubted the claim, but he did not walk away from the people making it. He remained with the group. He stayed close to a story he could not yet accept. Then 8 days passed. The disciples gathered again. The doors were locked again. The room looked familiar, but this time Thomas was there. And then Jesus appeared, no warning, no knock, no need for Thomas to ask the question again. The proof he demanded had entered the room, and the doubt was about to receive a direct answer. 8 days later, the disciples were together again. The doors were locked again. The room looked almost exactly the same. There was only one important difference. This time, Thomas was there. Then Jesus appeared among them. No knock, no warning. No one opened the door. He simply stood in the room and said, "Peace be with you." Then he turned to Thomas. Jesus did not begin with a general lesson about faith. He did not ask the others to repeat what Thomas had said. He did not pretend the conversation had never happened. He went directly to the exact conditions Thomas had given. "Put your finger here. Look at my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side." Thomas had made his demand when Jesus was not visibly in the room. Now Jesus repeated it back to him almost word for word. Apparently the meeting notes had reached him, but Jesus did not humiliate Thomas. He did not gather the disciples around and announce, "Everyone, Thomas has prepared several objections." He simply showed him the wounds. That was where the famous scene changed. Thomas's doubt was no longer an argument he could repeat from a safe distance. The answer was standing in front of him. He had asked for the nail marks. There they were. He had asked for the wound in Jesus' side. There it was. The same marks that had convinced Thomas the story was over were now attached to a living Jesus. The wounds had not disappeared. Their meaning had changed. At the cross, they looked like proof of defeat. In that locked room, they became proof that defeat had not been final. Thomas had wanted to know whether this was truly the same Jesus who had been crucified. Jesus answered without performing a new miracle or giving a long explanation. He brought the evidence Thomas already knew. That was enough to expose the real problem. Thomas had not simply wanted information. He had built a condition between himself and belief. Unless he saw, he would not believe. Now he saw. Jesus ended with a direct command: "Stop doubting and believe." The sentence was firm, but Jesus had still returned. He came back to the room Thomas had missed. He stood in front of the disciple who had refused the testimony, and he answered the exact demand Thomas had made. No public punishment, no dramatic debate, just the wounds, the command, and Thomas facing the impossible with no second-hand report between them. For 8 days, Thomas had remained unconvinced. He had heard that Jesus was alive. He had stayed with the group. He had waited behind the condition he created. Now the condition had been met. The doubt that had survived testimony could not remain unchanged in front of Jesus. The room went quiet. His answer would redefine the entire scene, and Thomas was about to answer with words no one expected from the disciple everyone would remember for doubting. Thomas stood in front of Jesus. The wounds were visible. The man who had been crucified was alive. And Thomas did not ask for anything else. No second test, no further explanation, no independent review from Jerusalem. The conditions disappeared the moment the answer stood in front of him. Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." That was not a hesitant conclusion. It was not, "Fine, I suppose the others were right." Thomas moved from refusing their testimony to making one of the strongest confessions in the entire story. He did not simply admit that Jesus had returned. He declared who Jesus was. That is why the usual nickname tells only half the story. Thomas doubted, but the story did not stop there. He heard the report and resisted it. He demanded evidence. He saw Jesus. Then he answered. The doubt created the tension. The confession delivered the ending. Jesus replied, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." That response reached far beyond Thomas. The disciples in the room had seen Jesus. Thomas had now seen him too. But the people who would later hear this story would receive what Thomas had received first: testimony. They would not stand in that room. They would not see the wounds for themselves. They would hear the witnesses and decide what to do with their words. Thomas had once rejected that position. Now his own confession became part of the testimony passed forward. There was some irony in that. The man who refused to believe the report became one of the reasons the report would continue. History has a sense of timing, but the story does not celebrate Thomas for doubting. It also does not leave him trapped inside the label. His demand was answered. His position changed. And when he finally spoke, he did not offer a careful compromise. He confessed. That is the real payoff. Thomas became famous for the sentence, "Unless I see, I will not believe." But his final words in the scene were not about what he refused to believe. They were about the person standing in front of him, "My Lord and my God." The greatest reversal was not simply that Thomas doubted after hearing Jesus was alive. It was that Jesus returned, addressed the doubt directly, and Thomas responded without another argument. He had missed the first appearance. He did not miss the meaning of the second. For centuries, people would call him Doubting Thomas. The label was memorable. The ending was stronger. He was not only the disciple who doubted, he was the disciple whose doubt was answered, and whose answer became confession. Thomas heard Jesus was alive and still doubted. Then he saw him. And the man remembered for doubt ended the story declaring exactly who Jesus was. Which misunderstood Bible story should be simplified next? Peter, Mary Magdalene, or Pilate?